Why do you think the modernist Catholic leaders, I guess there are some that could be considered modernist, I'm not going to make a blanket statement here, but why do you think that they're threatened by the traditional Latin Mass? We are experiencing bans in certain cities, including North Carolina. One example that B-Rock makes is a seminarian friend of ours was corrected for doing his daily breviary in Latin and told not to.
I share your frustration, of course, that as all of our viewers and listeners know, I celebrate traditional Latin Mass according to our constitutions in the Institute of Christ the King exclusively, and I love the traditional Latin Mass and do everything I can to promote it. But before I answer your question directly, I just want to walk you through something that will hopefully encourage us to pray more for these individuals who seem to have this almost irrational hatred of the Latin Mass. That if you imagine the time before the Council, the Second Vatican Council, that is, if you study the history of liturgical change, that the changes didn't just start in the 1960s. That the entire 20th century was a time of vast liturgical upheaval. And if you were a seminarian, I remind our young men in formation often, that if you were a young seminarian in the 1940s or 50s, by the time you got to 1970, your entire life had been one of liturgical change. You had your breviary had changed several times. You saw feasts get suppressed, vigils disappear, octaves disappear. Holy Week changed at least a couple times. You saw the translation snap back once again. And then when the council started, by the time you got to the council, your entire life was liturgical change. And then they just kept talking about more changes and just kept going. So I think we need to have a certain measure of compassion, even for these individuals who appear to be, so vehemently opposed to the Latin Mass, because, their own formation, their own experience of the sacred liturgy may have been one of constant change and upheaval. And so, there are several things we could say in that vein, that if they were individuals who were deeply invested in the project of the liturgical reform, as they reach their latter years, they've invested their entire lives into this liturgical reform, and so they may view as an existential threat, anything that harkens back to an earlier time, that they underwent so many changes, and it's almost like a suggestion to them that maybe there was something wrong about those changes, or that we could be a threat to them in some way, and at the same time, just having, as I said, having some compassion for those rank and file priests who just were constantly submitted to changes. But at the same time, coming back to your question specifically, you're absolutely right. There's no reason for us to persecute the Latin Mass. That as I think if you look at someone like Pope Benedict, who I deeply admired and respect, and pray for his eternal repose, though I fear we probably don't need to pray for him as much as we can pray to him. God willing, that'll be made clear in time. But Pope Benedict was someone who was very enthusiastic about the liturgical reform, but he was so rare insofar as he had the humility to admit, that the effects weren't quite what they all had believed, and he had the further humility to admit that we can't, and to proclaim in his own action in the Summorum Pontificum that liberated the use of the Latin Mass, that what was sacred for our fathers has to be sacred for us too, and he had the prudence to liberate the Latin Mass, not to impose his own views on the Church, but simply allow the Mass to speak for itself. And so it is my hope that the experience of the seminarian you're referring to in the very near future will be a distant memory, that we can allow the Latin Mass simply to breathe again and to speak for itself, without any rancor, without any aspersions cast on our fellow Catholics that we need to love and respect, and permit them their own forms of worship as well. But that we would continue to argue for the liturgical peace, that Pope Benedict had ushered in, that we hope in due time will return, that of us being able to exist and live, to flourish together with our fellow Catholics in the Church's traditional forms of worship. So, I thought it might be helpful for you to have some of those historical reflections, encourage us to pray more for those individuals, to maybe understand where many of them are coming from. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. Solution is one of liturgical peace, and I hope that Pope Benedict's solution is one that Pope Leo restores at some point.
Over on YouTube, Cernility asks this: if having the Mass in Latin is more extrinsically meritorious, intrinsically, I think is what the actual word is, more meritorious than the vernacular. Would it be the same for the Eastern liturgies being said in Greek?
Very often our Blessed Savior's crucifixion is depicted in art as we believe it was historically, of course, that as St. John tells us about the titulum that hung over our Savior's cross, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews, that it was written in 3 languages, that in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek for passers-by. And many commentators have suggested that these are the 3 sacred languages hallowed by that very moment and by their sacred usage throughout our salvation history. If we zoom out a little bit, because there are, the Church has sanctified the usage of other particular languages. You could think of Church Slavonic for some Eastern Christians, some other local languages in many of the particular churches at peace and communion with the Holy See, that the importance is the fundamental importance, and don't get me wrong, of course, Latin and Greek and Hebrew have a superlative and a special place, that they've been sanctified in important ways that no other languages have. But the real key at the heart of it is that we're using a language that's consecrated to God. That even the Latin of the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, or the Breviary, the Greek of the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, it's not the Greek that's spoken on a daily basis in Athens today. It's not the Latin that you'd hear if it were still a living language as it is in some places. That we're using a language that's consecrated to God, and we're using it in a way that's also consecrated to Him. And very often, unfortunately, as we switched to the vernacular, we also switched the way that we were speaking to God, not in a way that was acknowledging His transcendence and the love, the respect that we owe to Him. We also we brought the spirit of the world with us, as well as the language of the world. And so I'd like to validate your question, Sir Nilde, that certainly Greek, together with Latin, has a very hallowed usage, is absolutely and truly correctly venerated by our sacred traditions. But it also, just want to emphasize that point about, it's just as much of how we're using these languages that sanctifies them, just as much as the languages themselves.